Okay, so the last page on in this class um, is more about music theory, and harmony might be a little intimidating because it's very elegant, but it's also quite elaborate aspect of music theory. Uh, it's very much Western and pop music oriented. So, it means that it's an advantage and a disadvantage. If you want to move to other musical styles and cultures, you'll probably need either to incorporate harmony in some other ways or think it differently. And so it's, I wouldn't say double-edged sword because, if you think harmonically, you might not think in another way. It always helps to know about these rules, but also know that you might want to ignore them at a certain point. So what what is harmony? I mean, it's very much also related to scales and chords. Um, so scale degrees, we spoke about the idea that in LMS you can choose a scale. It will actually mark which notes on the keyboard belong to a certain uh, scale, and each scale has a key or tonality. So the idea that you have a key or a tonality is important because we very often, once we have a scale, we have a degree, it grounds us in a certain convention of so-called tension and resolution. We kind of gravitate towards uh, the tonality itself, which is usually the lowest note in that scale. So if you speak about C major, you kind of gravitate to go back to that C major. And this is, of course, a huge overgeneralization, but I think we need to start somewhere. So if you have scale degrees, so if you have something called like a C major, uh, it will be a key. It will be something, or we'll say a scale in the key of C, and it has a major tonality. Usually, it is a scale built on starting on the note of C, and has a certain sequence of notes. And same thing if you take a C minor, it will be a scale that is built on C and a slightly different set of notes. In these scales, you start building chords, and we played with the chord tool in LMMS without really explaining what it is. So here's my chance, kind of a little bit, give an insight about what chords are. Most of the chords that we work with are actually the few first ones in LMMS, the major, the minor, maybe the diminished chord, the augmented chord. If you go to jazz, you add a slightly more elaborate chord, the seventh chord. But the first ones usually are built from three notes. This is why they're called often triads. And then if you add another one, you often call them seven chords, because the actual note that you would add on top of the triad would be usually, if you just count them as steps in the scale, will be on the seventh note in that scale. Now, one thing that happens is that once you are in a specific scale, the chord that is built on each note in that scale could be assigned a number. And that number will be, if it's built on the lowest note, it will be 1. On the second one, it will be 2. If it's built on the fourth, it will be 4, 5, and so on. You, of course, have 3 and 6 and 7. We have a total of 8, right? So, for example, in the key of C major, the first chord is also called C major, but it's C major triad, and is the vote. And then you can either write this, the C major triad, or we can just put the number 1, okay? The second chord, if you look at the C major scale, and again, that might be beyond what you will feel comfortable with, so the last thing I want is to confuse you, but if you have time and you're interested in music theory, check what is the chord on the second degree. So if you're in the C scale and you look at the note of D, you will see that if you build a triad on the second degree, it will be a minor, it will be D minor. Okay, so sometimes you can write D minor, but you can also write this as 2, and we would write this as lowercase just because it's a minor chord. And I know that I'm introducing here things that take a long time. You take music. I'm not sure which class it is where you kind of study the basics of music theory. But what I want you to kind of do regardless of the level of detail that we're going to study or take away from this introduction to harmony, is the following idea, because this idea you can kind of follow in here. You don't really need to know much about music theory to understand what I'm going to say next. And this is the idea that there are chord progressions. You created a chord progression with the first homework, and then you arpeggiated this. You created just a sequence of musical colors, right? But they're formulas. And normally these formulas are built in a way that start somewhere, go somewhere else, and return. So the basic music formula is often 1-5-1. You can try and just put a major chord on one. You choose your scale. So let's say C. So you put on the C. Then you go to the fifth step, which will be a G, and then you go back to a C. Okay. If you're not in the C scale, if you are in a different tonality or key, let's say we just shift by one, D, that'll be D. Then the fifth will be A major, and going back to D major, if this is a major progression. Okay. Now, one interesting thing about music and music theory, which kind of some people really buy into this, and I think it's a very powerful idea. It's a little bit overarching, whatever, stating that all music is actually built through this progression. So there is somebody called Schenker, and Schenker's analysis actually shows that you can kind of collapse all music into this one big progression going from 1 to 5 to 1, at least all Western music, classical music. Maybe it oversimplifies things, but it just gives the idea that there is this tension, or this idea that you go from some starting point to the fifth degree, which is called also the dominant chord, which is the point of maximum tension, and then eventually you return to 1. So you can almost think about this as dramaturgical concept. You start, then something happens, and then it's resolved. But there are other chord progressions. So for instance, a very popular one is this one. It's going 1-5, but instead of jumping back to 1, it goes to 6, which is sometimes called the septive cadence. Then it goes back to 4, which is kind of related to 1, but in a much weaker way. So you don't really resolve. You kind of like you still keep this longing to resolve. It's partially resolved. So you create a tension, then you falsely resolve it, and then you kind of like keep in that surprise, kind of like, I wouldn't say here is a surprising way of trying to find a resolution that you would expect. Play this video. It's a lot of fun. It basically shows you how many musical pieces are built on this progression. Okay, you'll recognize a lot of these songs, and try to hear how basically the same skeleton, the same set of chords allows you to create very different moods, and kind of pushes your creativity forward. So a little bit more advanced down there, you can have a chord progression chart. Some people try to see, can we kind of tell what chords should follow which chord in major key, in minor key. If you think about creating your own chord progressions, you can try out these chords. What it mostly shows here is that, yes, there's this final resolution, either from 5 to 1 or from the 7 to 1. And again, I didn't explain so much how you read all these codes, except for saying that this is degree. So the capital ones are the majors, the smaller ones are the minors. This little circle here means a diminished chord, and you need to study that separately. But kind of you see that there is this progression within major key, minor key, and you don't have to stay with these keys. Many times people move from one key to another key. That even makes it more interesting. But there is this idea that there is this kind of a progression that the 4 or the 2 usually lead to 5 or the 7, and they are resolved here. And if they're not resolved, you can keep on circling here. And the same also in the minor key. The 2 and the 4, just the 4 in the minor key is a minor. Go to 5 and 7, go to 1, which is a minor. and you have these progressions, they're slightly different here, okay? But I mean, this is not like any mandatory prescription of how to move. You can skip chords. You can also change these. It's maybe kind of an overall motivation generalization that just emphasizes the idea that you have the dominant chords and you have these subdominants or predominants that lead to dominance, and there is this area of chords that allows you to prepare and wander around until you kind of hit something from which you want to go to the climax and then resolve. I think this kind of gives a motivation more than really solid knowledge about what harmony is. But if you keep this in mind, you listen to this example, and try kind of to get used to this concept of moving in the scale and jumping back to resolution, I think it will translate eventually to ability to hear, tension and resolution, climax and preparation of that climax, and the final kind of calming down in different gradations of expectation in music, which, like a lot of, as I said, Western and popular music are actually playing with these notions of harmony as a way to tell the musical story or create a musical drama. So this is in I don't know how long it was, 10 minutes about Western harmony. Okay, thank you for listening.